Ever since I've been alive, the United States has been the richest and most powerful country in the world. With a military to match, they seemingly have interests in every part of the world. But this hasn't always been the case, and today I want to have a look at a couple of brothers that helped make America the country it is today, and show how if it weren't for a couple of people with very specific views, the world may be a very different place. So our story starts back in the late 19th century with the US Secretary of State. The Secretary of State is the head of the State Department, which is the department which deals with international relations and foreign affairs. In short, second only to the President, they have the most influence over how the US treats foreign powers. So in 1892, under President Harrison, this job went to John W. Foster. John only held this position for a short amount of time, but left a lasting impression when he helped overthrow the Hawaiian Queen Liliuokalani. He did this for two reasons. One, because he realised how valuable Hawaii could be as a military outpost if it were in US hands. And two, because a couple of hundred years ago, a group of American missionaries had gone over to Hawaii to spread the good word of the Lord. Descendants of these missionaries set up plantations on the island, establishing very profitable businesses. However, the new Queen's economic policies threatened their way of life. Or at least they thought they did. It was more due to the US's 1890 McKinley Act, which reduced the import tax on sugar, but we're not going to go there, we haven't got enough time. Either way, the plantation owners didn't have enough power on their own to overthrow the Queen. But things quickly changed in January 1893 when the US sent troops over to Hawaii with the explicit intent of helping them overthrow the government. After a successful coup, the US put one of those plantation owners, Sanford Dole, in power. And yes, that's the same Dole that's now valued at over $1 billion. John W. Foster was the first US Secretary of State ever to help overthrow a foreign power, and he did so in the name of US corporate and military interests. After his time in office, John became an advocate for big business, and essentially one of the first lobbyists ever. He'd go around persuading government officials to enact policies that would help his corporate friends. Really, this video could be about John W. Foster, and it probably would be if it weren't for the fact that his grandchildren took this idea and ran with it. In the same year the Hawaiian Queen was overthrown, John's grandson, Alan, was born. 5 years younger than his brother Foster, the two were inseparable from a young age. Their father was a Presbyterian minister, but they always looked up to their grandfather John and were just fascinated by his work. On top of this, the boys' uncle, Robert Lansing, would also be US Secretary of State through the First World War. Every summer, the boys would go out on fishing trips with their grandfather, where they'd get as much exposure to his line of work as they could. On these trips, the boys would be witness to massive conversations about international relations, sometimes with foreign diplomats present. At first, they were expected to sit and listen, but as the boys got older, they became a more and more active part of the conversation and debate. This would happen every summer, and quite a lot of winters as well if the boys' grandfather was able to take them away. And this is how they spent their life, all the way up until college. Foster would graduate from Princeton in 1908, having studied law. He was hard-working and devoted to his studies, unlike his brother Alan, who also went to Princeton, but was more concerned with the nightlife than he was the lecture theatres. It was around this time that Alan started dating a girl called Janet Avery. This only lasted a short while before Alan decided she was boring and dumped her. I only mention this because in 1912, Foster married Janet Avery, and they lived together for the rest of their lives. When he graduated, Foster applied for a job at the Wall Street law firm Sullivan & Cromwell, a company that we're going to have to take a second to understand if this video is going to make any sense. Sullivan & Cromwell were established in 1879, and they specialised in the formation of massive corporate conglomerates. They helped Thomas Edison and JP Morgan form Edison General Electric. Now known as GE, it is still one of the top 150 largest US firms. In 1901, they helped a group of US steel manufacturers merge together to form, well, US Steel, and they were a key part in the financing of the Panama Canal, a project that started a few years later. Sullivan & Cromwell practiced a new form of legal representation that wasn't concerned with legal defence as much as it was trying to persuade governments to do stuff that would be in the interests of their massive corporate clients. Foster applied for a low-level position at the company, which he easily got due to his grandfather's long-term friendship with William Cromwell. While Alan is at Princeton not doing any work, a group of Bosnian Serbs attack and kill the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Now, the Bosnian-Austro-Hungarian War didn't have much of a ring to it, so the rest of Europe decided they could get involved as well, and we could just call it the First World War. In 1916, Alan would graduate Princeton and join the State Department, which was an easy get for him because his uncle was the boss. He was quickly sent off to Switzerland, where he could work as a spy trying to get information from foreign dignitaries. Alan wasn't in Switzerland long, but he did start dating a girl from the Czech Republic. However, British intelligence suggested that she might be working for the Austrians. So Alan, one evening, took her out on a date, and then after said date, dropped her off with 2 British men, where she was never seen again. At the same time, Foster was getting his first chance to impress his new buddies at Sullivan & Cromwell, with a problem some of their clients were having over in Cuba. The president of Cuba at the time was very pro-business, allowing American companies essentially to do anything they wanted within his country. However, following a questionably legitimate election in 1916, there was a left-wing uprising led by José Miguel Gómez. So to get an idea of just how much power the US had in Cuba at the time, not only were most of the plantations US owned, but also almost all the railroad networks and telecommunication systems. Now many of these US owned companies whose profits were now threatened by Gomez were represented by Sullivan and Cromwell themselves. So in order to make a good name for himself, Foster had lunch with his uncle and Secretary of State Robert Lansing. Foster suggested to Lansing that it might be a good idea to park a couple of US destroyers just off the Cuban coastline to act as a sort of deterrent. This wouldn't be enough to stop the rebellion, and eventually the US would have to send troops onto Cuban soil to protect the plantations themselves. The Cuban people protested the regime with a series of peaceful labour strikes. However, to the US, peaceful labour strikes are pretty much socialism, and socialism is pretty much communism, so the US troops flooded the streets, forcing the Cuban people back into the work. And with that, for the first of many, many times, Foster Dulles had helped orchestrate a US invasion for the sake of his corporate interests working abroad. This is something that Foster would end up specialising in, usually through bribing foreign powers into doing what was best for his clients. When World War I ended, Alan, who was missing his job as a spy, joined his brother Foster at Sullivan and Cromwell, where they both continued to work their way up the corporate ladder and up through the ranks of the Republican Party. So we move into the 1930s, and as the Great Depression hits, Foster is becoming more and more concerned that a dwindling American economy could lead to a rise in the popularity of communism in the West. Naturally, this led Foster to ally with another group of anti-communists that were rising in Europe at the time, the Nazi Party. And just to be clear, this isn't one of those was kind of friends with Hitler in 1932, then realised he was a bad guy kind of deals. Foster was an ally with the Nazi Party all the way through the Second World War, even though he was living in the US at the time. In 1933, working for the State Department, Alan would go and meet the German Chancellor Adolf Hitler. He didn't massively like the guy, and it would be 2 years later when he returned and Hitler was in power that he realised this was not something that he could ignore. Meanwhile, Foster was busy bringing Germany into the nickel cartel. So much like OPEC does for oil, cartels are a way for international producers to regulate the price of a product. In this case, it's a group of all the countries that produce nickel. Now, Germany wasn't a part of this group, meaning they had much less choice over how much they would get and the price they would be able to buy nickel at. And why was nickel important? Well, it's a key ingredient in stainless steel, and it was used at the time, as it is now, for making the armour for tanks. In other words, due to the direct actions of Foster Dulles, Nazi Germany were able to armour their tanks not only more cheaply, but more easily as well. Now at this point, even some other partners at Sullivan and Cromwell were starting to see the issue. In 1935, there was a vote to see whether or not they should keep operations going in Germany. Foster was the only person to vote in favour of this, and when the vote was overturned, he reportedly cried. So when the US eventually joined the Second World War, they had a problem. See, the US has always had a series of intelligence networks, such as the NSA, but they've never worked together, which meant the intelligence that was collected was always a bit sporadic and kind of useless. If the US was going to be involved in a world war, they were going to need one group to collect useful information, and they already were involved in a world war, so they really needed that group yesterday. For this reason, the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, was set up, and the co-founder, Bill Donovan, quickly got Alan involved, who was more than happy to be a spy again. OSS operations are absolutely their own video, and not something I'm going to get into right now. But it is safe to say that Alan did actually make a concerted effort to try and stop Hitler. I only give him that credit because Foster, at the same time, was not doing that. While Alan was busy fighting the Nazis, Foster was helping his German clients, such as IG Farben and Merck, with their US operations. With Foster's help, those German companies were able to create bottlenecks in the US supply line, massively hindering the war effort. Now, some nerds would call that treason, but Foster had his brother Alan in the State Department, so he kind of got away with it. Spoiler alert, World War II ended eventually, and when it did, Alan was intensely ready to be a spy again. He quickly started rallying for a peacetime intelligence agency, and his wish was soon granted when the newly elected Harry Truman created the Central Intelligence Group, before signing the 1947 National Security Act, which expanded the group's power and turned it into the Central Intelligence Agency. So the CIA, by Alan's design, was unlike any other intelligence agency. So usually for international intelligence operations, you have two groups. You have the group that collects the information, and then you have the group that acts on the information, and they do not meet in the middle. The reason it was done this way was to stop bias, so you don't end up looking for the information that helps justify the actions you wanted to take. And over the next few decades of the CIA's existence, we would see exactly how true that would be. So for the remainder of Truman's presidency, Alan continued to work freelance for the CIA while also still working for Sullivan and Cromwell, and Foster, while also still working for Sullivan and Cromwell, started working his way up the Republican Party. This investment would pay off massively for both of them when in 1953 Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected president. Eisenhower had much less desire to regulate the CIA than Truman did, and on top of this he was much more willing to use military power to remove foreign political powers that he wasn't as happy with. Within 1953, Alan would first be given a 6-week trial at the CIA before eventually becoming director, and at the same time, Foster joined his uncle and grandfather before him in becoming Secretary of State. These two brothers, who had spent their lives preparing for a career in international politics, were now on the world stage, and they were about to redefine how America treated the rest of the world. They wanted a way to test out their new powers, and quickly the boys' attention turned to Iran. You see, Iran was sitting on a massive oil deposit that was first discovered in 1909, and the first company to start drilling it was the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Seeing how profitable the area was about to become, the UK government bought a 51% share in the oil company, effectively giving them complete control over Iranian oil. This went on for a few decades and world wars, until in 1951, where the Iranian people elected a pro-democracy leader, Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh in 1952 tried to nationalise Iranian oil, essentially giving the profits of their natural resource back to the Iranian government. The UK government were understandably quite concerned about this, so they put sanctions on Iran and then asked the US government for help. When Eisenhower first learnt of the situation, his gut reaction was to help the Iranian people through the British blockade. But through a series of conversations with his CIA friends, Eisenhower was convinced that the Iranian people were actually communists in disguise, and that this fight would be the next frontier of the Cold War. The US were able to stop the Iranian uprising with relative ease, and they put their guy back in power. And to make sure this never happened again, the CIA made a point of murdering any member of the Communist Tudor Party left in Iran. So Iranian oil production was once again denationalised, but now with a slight difference. Now 40% of all Iranian oil profits went to US oil producers. And in terms of the legacy that the US left Iran with, in 1979 the Shah was again replaced, but now this time with a much more right-wing fundamentalist group. And that was in no small part due to the fact that the CIA had literally killed off the whole of the left-wing movement in Iran. So now we know how the US likes to do its international business, we need to talk about Guatemala. Jorge Ubico had been in power since 1931 and was a massively pro-business, pro-US leader. Ubico was the only candidate on the last electoral ballot he was in, and he had a lot of friends in the United Fruit Company. United Fruit was a US-based fruit company that operated out of Guatemala and essentially owned the country. Not only did United Fruit own over 20% of all farmable land in Guatemala, but they also ran the railroad tracks, the telecommunication networks, most of the shops, and the only main port into the Atlantic Ocean. United Fruit had a stranglehold on any part of Guatemalan business that had anything to do with the export or production of fruits in the area. Ubico considered the working class to be beasts, only capable of working for the upper classes. He would have farmers tied up like cattle and delivered to United Fruit plantations in order to work. Oh, and who was it that legally represented United Fruit? None other than Sullivan and Cromwell themselves. So in 1944, the Guatemalan people quite rightly saw United Fruit as an impediment to their progress as a country, and left-wing revolutionary Jacobo Arbenz helped overthrow the government, running on a platform of agrarian reform. Arbenz was absolutely not a communist, but this didn't matter to the Dulles brothers or the US as a whole, who were massively worried about what was going on in Guatemala at the time. To deal with this, not only did they stop selling guns to Guatemala, but they also increased gun shipments to neighbouring Honduras and Nicaragua. The final straw would be in 1952, when Arbenz would attempt to redistribute land owned by United Fruit. Now, just to be clear, this was actually a really good deal for United Fruit. It was only land that currently wasn't under cultivation, so they weren't even using it, and they were offered twice what they ever paid for the land. But this wasn't enough for the US government, who released a series of statements saying that Guatemala had been infiltrated by communists. In August 1953, Operation PB Success was authorised by Eisenhower in an attempt to remove Arbenz from power. The CIA first tried to bribe Arbenz with $2 million, which didn't work, and then they threatened his life, which again didn't work, so finally they had to use a militia force headed by Castillo Armas. Armas was given enough money to get a small group of militia together. They were then trained by the CIA in Honduras and Nicaragua, and were armed and sent into Guatemala to get rid of Arbenz. Infantry would not be enough on its own, so the CIA adopted some psychological warfare techniques. They sent death threats to left-wing political leaders and Arbenz loyalists, even going as far as to send little wooden coffins in the post. In 1954, the radio station The Voice of Liberation started broadcasting anti-communist propaganda. The radio station? Well, it was run by the CIA and it was broadcasting out of Miami. Under massive pressure from the US, Arbenz was desperate for guns and had to acquire them from the only place he could, Soviet-run Czechoslovakia. Even though this was a direct result of the US cutting off arms to Guatemala and then invading the country, they saw it as justification to deal their final blow. The CIA bombed the Guatemalan capital and Arbenz was forced to flee. On the 27th of June 1954, Arbenz would release his resignation tape. In it, he stated he was resigning in order to eliminate the pretext for the invasion. After taking power, the CIA-backed regime started killing off any Labour leaders, left-wing politicians, or even farmers that had embraced Arbenz's way too much. In the following 40 years of political unrest, over 250,000 people would be killed. That's over 7% of Guatemala's population in the 50s. And Allen, whose plan this all was in the first place, would later refer to Guatemala as a clean coup. If the whole point of that invasion was to stop the communist uprising, it was absolutely unnecessary. However, if it was to protect the rights of the United Fruit Company and the US operations abroad, then it was absolutely a success. 17 years after the invasion, in 1971, Arbenz was found in Mexico City, scalded to death in a bathtub. I'm not going to make any assumptions about his death here, but it's safe to say that David Talbot, author of The Devil's Chessboard and expert on the Dulles brothers, deems his death to be suspicious at the very least. The main focus of this video is US invasions, but I can't mention Allen Dulles without talking about MKUltra. MKUltra was the CIA-led mind control program that used LSD, electroshock therapy and torture to try and manipulate people's minds. There were two main goals of the operation. One was to find a way to extract information from people, and the second was to find a way to wipe their memories at the same time. The US thought if they were able to work this out, it would be incredibly useful for interrogating Russian spies. But they did also have another issue. The suicide rate for ex-CIA members was worryingly high, mostly due to all the atrocities they had to commit in the name of defending American capitalism. MKUltra is absolutely its own video for another day, but there is one detail I just wanted to highlight that shows exactly why conspiracy thought has gone the way it has in recent years. So in order to experiment on people, the CIA needed people, and what better people to pick than the people that have already given their lives to you? That's why a lot of MKUltra experiments operated out of US Air Force bases. There are reports of US soldiers going to local bars and being bought drinks and prostitutes by men in suits. Of these accounts, a lot of people reported either visual or auditory hallucinations, which would make sense because the CIA had just found out about LSD and they were having a lot of fun messing around with it at the time. So the CIA were busy spiking whoever they could with acid. And one of the soldiers, who we know for a fact was on the base at the time, was Lee Harvey Oswald. So to summarise, Allen Dulles becomes head of the CIA starts a mind control program which is mostly there to mess around with soldiers' heads. One of those soldiers is Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald, who eventually would assassinate JFK. JFK, who fired Allen Dulles because of the Bay of Pigs. And can you see now why it's all a conspiracy? Well, okay, maybe it's just the fact that there's a lot of connections here, but not necessarily cause and effect, but you can absolutely see where these ideas come from. So finally, it's time to talk about the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in 1961. So we should all be pretty familiar with how this goes now. President Batista was a pro-US Cuban leader who allowed American companies to dominate the Cuban economy, especially in the production of sugarcane. Rising tensions between Batista and his people led to a Cuban revolution, headed in part by Fidel Castro. Castro's revolutionaries demanded such things as control over their own natural resources and economic independence. Castro was not a communist, but he did start appointing communists such as Che Guevara to cabinet positions. He nationalised oil refineries, took land back from US-owned companies like United Fruit, and built public infrastructure like hospitals, social housing and schools. Just to be clear, Fidel Castro was not benevolent. He started a campaign of political censorship, which involved killing anyone that disagreed with his views, which is something the US would never condone. The CIA did not like the idea of a communist country so close to the US border, so Allen Dulles set up a team to help deal with the Castro problem, mostly made up of people that helped him work on the Guatemalan coup. Over 1,500 soldiers, from Batista supporters to other anti-Castro groups, were trained and armed by the CIA. In 1960, they went as far as to organise the rebels a fleet of ships and planes that couldn't be traced back to the US. So in November 1960, JFK wins the US election. Both him and Nixon had run on an anti-Cuba platform, trying to best each other on who could be more tough on their socialist neighbours. Kennedy hated the idea from the start, but he was told he'd receive massive political backlash if he were to try and stop it. Originally, the plan was to land at Trinidad. This would have been a good idea because it gave the US access to a port to escape if need be, but it also gave them access to the Escambray Mountains, where the Cuban revolutionaries had been gathering since Castro's rule. Kennedy wasn't a fan of the plan, and after a lot of negotiation they settled on landing at the Bay of Pigs instead. The Bay of Pigs was a good landing site, in that it had a cool name and not really much else. You see, the Bay of Pigs is surrounded by a swamp, meaning that even if they were able to land, US soldiers couldn't really move quickly away from the land and into the country. There was also a radio tower overlooking the bay, meaning as soon as US troops landed, Cubans were able to radio Castro and tell him exactly what was going on. Castro sent 25,000 soldiers, who defeated the invaders in just a few days. Many of these invaders were caught, and the US were no longer able to hide their involvement. This was a bad look for Kennedy, and it was really bad for US-Cuban relations, which led to Cubans becoming a lot more reliant on Soviets. Those same Soviets then wanted to store missiles on Cuban soil, which led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the closest we've ever got to nuclear war. And all of this happens because we're trying to protect a couple of sugar companies and their business interests. Because of the failure of the Bay of Pigs, JFK hated the CIA for the rest of his life. This also led to him firing Allen from his position as director. The Dulles brothers created a world in which America is not only responsible for world peace, but also for keeping the cogs of international capitalism moving. It has a position in the global economy that we take for granted, assuming that it's always been this way and it always has to be if we want the world to work the way it does. I want to give the parting message to this video to someone who knew much more about American diplomacy than I ever will. Dwight D. Eisenhower. In a farewell speech that was overshadowed by the election of JFK, Eisenhower warned us of what would happen if we let money dictate policy, and the overwhelming threat of the military-industrial complex.
We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. 3 of these involved our own country. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.